Section 11 of Psychological Types, or The Psychology of Individuation. Psychological Types, or The Psychology of Individuation, by Carl Gustav Jung, translated by Hilton Godwin Baines. Section 11. Chapter 2. Schiller's Ideas upon the Type Problem. Part 2. Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. A. The Superior and the Inferior Functions. Schiller also turns back, not of course to Rousseau's natural man, and here lies an essential difference, but to the man who lived under a Grecian heaven. But the retrospective orientation that is common to both is inextricably bound up with an idealization and overvaluation of the past. Schiller, in the wonder of pagan art, forgets the actual everyday Greek. Rousseau mounts to dizzying heights, losing himself in such phrases as, again in translation, "Natural man is wholly himself. He is an integral unity, an absolute whole," end quote, whereby he overlooks the fact that the natural man is wholly collective, that is, just as much in others as in himself, and is everything else besides a mere unity. In another passage, Rousseau says, quote, "We cling to everything. We clutch on to all times, places, men, things. All that is and all that will be matters to each of us. Our individual self is only the least part of ourselves. Each extends, as it were, over the whole earth, and becomes sensitive to this whole vast surface. Is it nature which thus bears men so far from themselves?" End quote. Rousseau deceives himself. He believes this state to be a recent development, but this is not so. Granted, it has only recently become conscious to us. It nonetheless always existed, and it reveals itself all the more vividly the further we descend into the origins. For what Rousseau depicts is nothing but that primitive collective mentality which Lévi-Brühl has aptly termed participation mystique. This state of suppression of the individuality is no new acquisition, but a residue of that archaic time when there was no individuality whatsoever. What we are dealing with is not, therefore, a recent suppression, but merely a new sense and awareness of the overwhelming power of the collective. One naturally projects this power into political and ecclesiastical institutions, as though there were not already ways and means enough for the evasion of even moral commands when occasion suited. In no way have these institutions that presumed omnipotence, for which they are from time to time assailed by innovators of every sort. The suppressing power lies unconsciously in ourselves, namely, in our own barbarian element with its primitive collective mentality. To the collective psyche, every individual development is obnoxious, which does not directly serve the ends of collectivity. Hence, the differentiation of the one function mentioned above, although certainly a development of an individual value, is still so largely conditioned by the viewpoint of collectivity that the individual himself, as we have already seen, actually suffers from this development. Both authors have to thank their imperfect acquaintance with earlier conditions of human psychology for their lapse into false judgments upon the values of the past. The result of this false judgment is a belief in the illusory picture of an earlier, more perfect type of man who somehow fell from his high estate. Backward orientation is in itself a relic of pagan thinking, for it is a well-known characteristic of the whole classic and barbaric mentality that it imagined a paradisiacal age as a golden forerunner of the present evil time. It was the great social and educational act of Christianity which first gave man a future hope, assuring him of a future possibility for the realization of his ideals. The stronger note of this retro-orientation in the more recent intellectual movements may be connected with the appearance of that general regression towards the pagan, which with the Renaissance made itself increasingly manifest. It seems to me certain that this retrogressive orientation must also have a definite influence upon the means selected for human education. For a mind thus oriented is ever seeking support in some phantasmagoria in the past. We could make light of this if the knowledge of the conflict between the types and the typical mechanisms were not constantly urging us to seek for that which could re-establish their unity. As we may see in the following passages, this goal had also a profound interest for Schiller. His fundamental idea about it is expressed in the following words, which indeed actually sum up what has just been said. Quote, Let a benevolent deity snatch in time the suckling from his mother's breast, nourish him with the milk of a better age, and let him ripen to maturity under that far Grecian heaven. Then, when he is become a man, let him return, a strange figure, into his own century, but not that he may delight it with his appearance, but terrible, like Agamemnon's son, to purify it." End quote. The leaning towards the Grecian model could scarcely be more clearly expressed, but in this narrow formulation one can also glimpse a limitation, which in the following paragraph urges him to a very essential amplification, for he continues, quote, "His material will he indeed take from the present, but his form he will borrow from an older age, yea, from beyond all ages, from the absolute, unchangeable unity of his being." End quote. Schiller clearly felt that he must go back still further into some primeval, heroic age where men were still half divine. He therefore continues, quote, "Here from the pure ether of his demonic nature wells forth the source of beauty, untainted by the depravity of the generations and epochs, which whirl in troubled eddies far below." End quote. Here is ushered in the lovely phantom of a golden age, when men were still gods, and were constantly refreshed with the vision of eternal beauty. But here, too, the poet has overtaken the thinker in Schiller. A few pages further on, the thinker again gets the upper hand. Quote, "The fact," says Schiller, "must cause one to reflect that in almost every epoch of history, when the arts blossomed and taste ruled, one finds that humanity declined. Furthermore, not one single example can be shown of a people where a high level and a wide universality of ascetic culture went hand in hand with political freedom and civic virtue, or where beautiful manners went with good morals, or polished behavior with truth." End quote. According to this familiar and in every way undeniable experience, those heroes of olden days must have pursued a none too scrupulous conduct of life, which, moreover, no single myth, either Grecian or otherwise, maintains. Beauty could still delight in her existence, for as yet there was neither penal code nor guardian of public morals. With the recognition of the psychological fact that living beauty unfolds her golden splendor only when soaring above a reality of gloom, torment, and squalor, Schiller's particular aim is undermined, for he had undertaken to prove that what was separated would be reconciled by the vision, enjoyment, and creation of the beautiful. Beauty was to be the mediator which should restore the primal unity of human nature. But, nevertheless, all experience goes to show that beauty needs her opposite as a necessary condition of her existence. As before it was the poet, it is now the thinker that possesses Schiller. He mistrusts beauty. He even holds it possible, arguing from experience, that she may exercise an unfavorable influence. Quote, "Wherever we turn our eyes into the world of the past, we find taste and freedom fleeing one another, and beauty establishing her sovereignty only upon the ruins of the heroic virtues." End quote. This insight, which is the product of experience, can hardly sustain the claim that Schiller makes for beauty. In the further pursuit of his theme, he even reaches a point where he abstracts the reverse of beauty with an all too enviable clarity. Quote, "Thus, if one's view about the effect of beauty is entirely influenced by what one learns from all bygone experience, one cannot be greatly encouraged in the work of educating feelings which prove to be so dangerous to the true culture of man. And, in spite of the danger of crudity and hardness, man is wiser to forego the softening power of beauty than, with every advantage of refinement, to be delivered over to her enervating influence." End quote. The matter between the poet and the thinker would surely allow of adjustment if the thinker took the words of the poet not literally but symbolically, which is how the tongue of the poet desires to be understood. Can Schiller have misunderstood himself? It would almost seem so. Otherwise he could not argue thus against himself. The poet sings of a spring of unsullied beauty, which flows beneath every age and generation, and is constantly swelling in every human heart. It is not the man of ancient Greece the poet means, but the old pagan in ourselves. That piece of eternal, unspoiled nature and natural beauty which lies unconscious but living within us, whose reflected splendor transfigures the shapes of former days, and for whose sake we even embrace the error that those distant men actually possessed the beauty which we are seeking. It is the archaic man in ourselves who, rejected by our collectively orientated consciousness, appears to us as hideous and unacceptable, but who is nevertheless the bearer of that beauty which we elsewhere unavailingly seek. This is the man the poet Schiller means, but the thinker Schiller mistakes him for his Grecian prototype. But what the thinker cannot logically deduce from all his massed material, and at which he labors in vain, the poet, in symbolical language, reveals to him as a promised land. It is now sufficiently clear from all that has been said that every attempt at an adjustment of the one-sided differentiation of the human being of our times has to reckon with the serious acceptance of the inferior, because undifferentiated functions. No attempt at mediation will succeed which does not understand how to release the energies of the inferior functions and to lead them over into differentiation. This process can take place only in accordance with the laws of energetics. That is, a potential must be created which offers the latent energies a possibility of coming into play. It would be a hopeless task, which nevertheless has been often undertaken, and as often foundered, to transform an inferior function directly into a superior one. It would be as easy to make a perpetual mobile. No inferior form of energy can be simply converted into a superior form unless at the same time a source of higher value lends its support. That is, the conversion can be accomplished only at the expense of the superior function. But under no circumstances can the initial value of the superior energy form be attained by the inferior function or resumed once more by the superior function. A leveling at some intermediate temperature must inevitably result. But for every individual who identifies himself with his one differentiated function, this entails a descent to a condition that is certainly balanced, but of a definitely lower value as compared with the apparent initial value. This conclusion is unavoidable. Every education of man which aspires after the unity and harmony of his nature has to deal with this fact. After his own manner, Schiller also draws this conclusion, but he struggles against accepting his results, even to the point where he has to renounce beauty. But when the thinker has uttered his ruthless judgment, the poet speaks again. Quote, "But it may be that experience is no tribunal before which a question like this shall be decided. And before we give weight to its testimony, let all doubt be set at rest that the beauty we speak of, and that against which these examples testify, is one and the same." End quote. One sees that Schiller here attempts to take his stand above experience. In other words, he bestows upon beauty a quality which experience does not grant her. He believes that, quote, "beauty must be proven a necessary condition of mankind," end quote. That is, a necessary, compelling category. He even speaks of a purely intellectual concept of beauty, and a transcendental way, quote, "which shall take us out of the round of appearances and away from the living presence of things. Who durst not go beyond reality will never vanquish truth." Unquote. A subjective resistance to the experimental, inevitable, downward way prompts Schiller to suborn the logical intellect in the service of feeling, thus forcing it to construct a formula which would ultimately make possible the attainment of the original aim, notwithstanding the fact that its impossibility is already sufficiently exposed. A similar violence is committed by Rousseau in his assumption that, whereas dependence upon nature does not involve depravity, it does if one is dependent upon man, from which he arrives at the following conclusion. Again, in translation, quote, "If the laws of nations, like those of nature, could have an inflexibility that no human force could ever vanquish, the dependence of men would become at once more like that of things. One could combine, in the Republic, all the advantages of the natural state with those of citizenship. One could add to the liberty, which exempts man from vice, the morality which raises him to virtue." End quote. Arising out of these reflections, he gives the following advice. Quote, "Keep the child dependent solely upon things. You will have followed the order of nature in the progress of his education. Do not force a child to stay when it wants to go, or to go when it wants to stay quiet. When the will of our children is not spoiled by our own fault, they desire nothing that is useless." End quote. But the misfortune lies in this, that never, under any circumstances, do the laws of nations possess that admirable accord with the laws of nature which could enable the civilized to be at the same time a natural state. If such a settlement could be regarded as at all possible, it could be conceived only as a compromise wherein neither of the two conditions could attain its own ideal, but both would remain far below it. Whoever wishes to attain the ideal of either state will have to rest with a statement that Rousseau himself formulated. Quote, "One must choose whether to make a man or a citizen, for at the same time one cannot make both." End quote. Both these necessities exist in ourselves, nature and culture. We cannot only be ourselves, we must also be related to others. Hence, a way must be found that is not a mere rational compromise. It must also be a state or process that wholly corresponds with the living being. It must be a semita et via sancta, as the prophet says, a via directa ita et stulti non errant per eram, that is, a highway and the way of holiness, a straight way, so that fools shall not err therein. Isaiah 35:8. I am therefore disposed to give the poet in Schiller his just due, although in this case he has encroached somewhat outrageously upon the province of the thinker. Since rational truths are not the last word, there are also irrational truths. In human affairs, what appears impossible upon the way of the intellect has very often become true upon the way of the irrational. Indeed, all the greatest changes that have ever affected mankind have come not by the way of intellectual calculation, but by ways which contemporary minds either ignored or rejected as absurd, and which only long afterwards became fully recognized through their intrinsic necessity. More often than not, they are never perceived at all, for the all-important laws of mental development are still to us a seven-sealed book. I am, however, little disposed to grant any considerable value to the philosophical demeanor of the poet, for the intellect is a deceptive instrument in his hands. What the intellect can achieve, it has in this case already done, for it disclosed the contradiction between desire and experience. To persist, then, in demanding a solution of this contradiction from philosophical thinking would be quite useless, and even if a solution could finally be thought out, the real obstacle would still confront us, for the solution does not lie in the possibility of thinking it, or in the discovery of a rational truth, but in the revealing of a way which real life can accept. Propositions and wise precepts have indeed never been wanting. If it were only a question of these, even in the remote days of Pythagoras, man had the finest opportunity of reaching the heights from every direction. Therefore, what Schiller proposes must not be taken in a literal sense, but rather as a symbol, which, in harmony with Schiller's philosophical temperament, assumes the character of a philosophical concept. Similarly, the transcendent way, which Schiller sets out to tread, must not be understood as a cognitional raisonnement, but symbolically as that way which a man always follows when he encounters an obstacle immediately inaccessible to his reason. In a word, an insoluble task. But before he is able to discover and follow this way, he must first abide a long time with the opposites into which his former way divided. The obstacle dams up the river of his life. Whenever such a damming up of libido occurs, the opposites, formerly united in the steady flow of life, fall apart and henceforth oppose one another like antagonists eager for battle. In a prolonged conflict, the opposites become exhausted, and, from the energy which goes out of them, is that third element created, which is the beginning of the new way. In accordance with this law, Schiller now devotes himself to a profound research of the actual opposites at work. Whatever the nature of the obstacle we may strike, provided only it be difficult, the cleavage between our own purpose and the contending object at once becomes a conflict in ourselves. For, inasmuch as I am striving to subordinate the contending object to my will, my whole being is gradually placed into relationship with it, corresponding, in fact, with the strong libido application, which, as it were, transvades a part of my being into the object. The result of this is a partial identification between certain portions of my personality and similar qualities in the nature of the object. As soon as this identification has taken place, the conflict is transferred into my own psyche. This introjection into myself of the conflict with the object creates an inner discord which gives rise to a certain impotence vis-à-vis the object, and also releases affects, which are always symptomatic of inner disharmony. But the affects prove that I am perceiving myself, and am therefore in a situation, if I am not blind, to apply my own observation upon myself, and to follow up the play of opposites in my own psyche. This is the way that Schiller takes. The division that he finds is not between the state and the individual, but in the beginning of the 11th letter, He conceives it as the duality of person and condition, namely as the self, or ego, and its changing affectedness. Whereas the ego has a relative consistency, its relatedness, or affectedness, is variable. Schiller thus intends to seize the discord at the root. Actually, the one side is also the conscious ego function, while the other is the collective relationship. Both determinants belong to human psychology, but the various types will respectively see these basic facts in quite a different light. For the introvert, the idea of the self is doubtless the abiding and dominant note of consciousness, and its antithesis for him is relatedness or affectedness. For the extrovert, on the contrary, much more stress is laid upon the continuity of the relation with the object, and less upon the idea of the self. Hence, for him, the problem is differently situated. We must hold this point in view and consider it more fully as we follow Schiller's further reflections. When, for instance, he says that the person reveals itself, quote, in the eternally constant self, and in this alone, end quote, this is viewed from the standpoint of the introvert. From the standpoint of the extrovert, on the other hand, we should say that the person reveals itself simply and solely in its relationship, that is, in the function of relation to the object. For only with the introvert is the person exclusively the ego. With the extrovert, the person lies in his affectedness and not in the affected self. His self is, as it were, of less importance than his affection, that is, his relation. The extrovert finds himself in the fluctuating and changeable, the introvert in the constant. The self is not eternally constant, least of all with the extrovert, for whom, as an object, it is a matter of small moment. To the introvert, on the other hand, it has too much importance. He therefore shrinks from every change that is at all liable to affect his ego. For him, affectedness can mean something directly painful, while to the extrovert it must on no account be missed. The following formulation immediately reveals the introvert. Quote, in every change to remain himself constant, referring every perception to experience, that is, to the unity of knowledge, and relating each of its varying aspects in his own time, to the law of all times. This is the command given him by his reasoning nature. End quote. The abstracting, self-contained attitude is evident. It is even made a supreme rule of conduct. Every occurrence must at once be raised to the level of experience. And from the sum of experience, a law for the future must also immediately emerge. Whereas the other attitude, in which no experience shall be made from the occurrence lest laws might transpire, which would hamper the future, is equally human. It is altogether in keeping with this attitude that Schiller cannot think of God as becoming, but only as eternally being. Hence, with unerring intuition, he also recognized the God-likeness of the introverted attitude towards the idea. Quote, man, presenting in his perfection, would be the constant unit, remaining eternally the same amid the floods of change. And man carries the divine disposition incontestably within his personality. End quote. This view of the nature of God agrees ill with his Christian incarnation and with those similar Neoplatonic views of the Mother of the Gods and of her Son, who descends into creation as demiurgos. But it is clear, from this view, to which function Schiller attributes the highest value, the divinity, that is to say, the constancy of the idea of the self. The self that is abstracted from affectedness is for him the most important thing, and hence, as the case with every introvert, this is the idea which he has chiefly developed. His God, his highest value, is the abstraction and conservation of the self. To the extrovert, on the contrary, God is the experience of the object, the fullest expansion into reality. Hence, a God who became human is to him more sympathetic than an eternal, immutable lawgiver. Here I must observe, in anticipation that these points of view should be regarded only as valid for the conscious psychology of the types. In the unconscious, the relations are reversed. Schiller seems to have had an inkling of this, although indeed his consciousness believes in an unchangingly existing God, yet the way to godhood is revealed to him by the senses, hence in affectedness, in the changing and living process. But this is, for him, the function of secondary importance. And, to the extent that he identifies himself with his ego and abstracts it from the changing process, his conscious attitude also becomes quite abstracted, whereby the function of affectedness or relatedness to the object perforce relapses into the unconscious. From this state of affairs, noteworthy consequences ensue. 1. From the conscious attitude of abstraction, which, in pursuit of its ideal, makes an experience from every occurrence, and from the sum of experience, a law, a certain constriction and poverty results, which is indeed characteristic of the introvert. Schiller clearly feels this in his relationship with Goethe, for he sensed Goethe's more extroverted nature as something objectively opposed to himself. Significantly, Goethe says of himself, quote, "As a contemplative man, I am an errant realist. I find that among all the things which confront me, I am in the position of desiring nothing from them or added to them, and I make no sort of discrimination among objects beyond their interest for myself." End quote. Concerning Schiller's effect upon him, Goethe very characteristically says, quote, "If I have served you as the representative of many objects, you have led me to a too intense observation of outer things and their relationships back into myself. You have taught me to view the many-sidedness of the inner man with finer equity," end quote, and so forth. Whereas in Goethe, Schiller finds an oft-times accentuated complement or fulfillment of his own nature, at the same time sensing his difference, which he indicates in the following way, quote, "Expect of me no great material wealth of ideas, for that is what I find in you. My need and endeavor is to make much out of little, and if ever you should realize my poverty in all that men call acquired knowledge, you will perhaps find that in many ways my aspiration has succeeded. Because my circle of ideas is smaller, I traverse it more quickly and oftener. I may, therefore, even make a better use of what small ready cash I own, creating a diversity through form which the contents lack. You strive to simplify your great world of ideas, while I seek variety for my small possessions. You have a kingdom to rule, and I only a somewhat numerous family of ideas, which I would fain to expand to a small universe." End quote. His letter to Goethe, August 31st, 1794. If we abstract from this utterance a certain feeling of inferiority, characteristic of the introvert, and add to it the fact that the extrovert's great world of ideas is not so much under his rule as he himself is subject to it, then Schiller's presentation gives a striking picture of the poverty which tends to develop as a result of an essentially abstract attitude. Number 2, a further result of the abstracting, conscious attitude, and one whose significance will become more apparent in the further course of our investigation, is that the unconscious develops a compensating attitude. For the more the relation to the object is restricted by the abstraction of consciousness, because too many experiences and laws are made, all the more insistently does a craving for the object develop in the unconscious. This finally declares itself in consciousness as a compulsive, sensuous hold upon the object, whereupon the sensuous tie takes the place of a feeling relation to the object, which is lacking, or rather suppressed, through abstraction. Characteristically, therefore, Schiller regards the senses, and not the feelings, as the way to godhood. His ego lies with thinking, but his affectedness, his feelings, with sensation. Thus, with him, the schism is between spirituality as thinking and sensuousness as affectedness or feeling. With the extrovert, however, matters are reversed. His relation to the object is developed, but his world of ideas is sensational and concrete. Sensuous feeling, or to put it better, the feeling that exists in the state of sensation, is collective. That is, it begets a state of relation or affectedness, which at the same time translates the individual into the condition of participation mystique, hence into a state of partial identity with the sensed object. This identity declares itself in a compulsory dependence upon the sensed object, and it is this which again prompts the introvert, after the manner of the circulus vitiosus, to an intensification of that abstraction which shall abolish both the burdensome relation and the compulsion it evokes. Schiller recognized this peculiarity of the sensuous feeling. Quote, "So long as he merely senses, craves, and works from desire, man is still nothing more than the world." End quote. But since, in order to escape affectedness, the introvert cannot abstract indefinitely, he ultimately sees himself forced to shape the external world. Quote, "That he may not be merely world, he must impart form to matter," says Schiller, and goes on, "He shall externalize all within and shape everything without." End quote. Both tasks, in their highest achievement, lead back to the idea of divinity from which I started out. This connection is important. Let us suppose the sensuously felt object to be a man. Will he accept this prescription? Will he, in fact, permit himself to take shape as though the man to whom he is related were his creator? To play the god on a small scale is certainly man's vocation, but ultimately even inanimate things have a divine right to their own existence, and the world long ago ceased to be chaos when the first man-apes began to sharpen stones. It would indeed be a serious business if every introvert wished to externalize his narrow world of ideas and to shape the external world accordingly. Such experiments happen daily, but the individual ego suffers, and very justly, for this God-likeness. For the extrovert, this formula should run: to internalize all that is without and shape everything within. This reaction, as we saw just now, Schiller evoked in Goethe. Goethe gives a telling parallel to this. He writes to Schiller, quote, "In every sort of activity I, on the other hand, am, one might almost say, completely idealistic. I ask nothing at all from objects, but instead I demand that everything shall conform to my conceptions." End quote. This means that when the extrovert thinks, things go just as autocratically as when the introvert operates externally. This formula, therefore, can hold good only where an almost complete stage has already been reached, when, in fact, the introvert has attained a world of ideas so rich and flexible and capable of expression that the object no longer forces him upon a Procrustean bed, and the extrovert such an ample knowledge of, and consideration for, the object, that a caricature of it can no longer arise when he operates with it in his thinking. Thus we see that Schiller bases his formula upon the highest possible, and therefore makes an almost prohibitive demand upon the psychological development of the individual, assuming also that he is thoroughly clear in his own mind what his formula involves in every particular. Be that as it may, it is at least fairly clear that this formula, quote, "to externalize all that is within and shape everything without," end quote, is the ideal of the conscious attitude of the introvert. It is based, on the one hand, upon the hypothesis of an ideal range of his inner world of concepts and formal principles, and, on the other, upon the possibility of an ideal application of the sensuous principle, which in that case no longer appears as affectedness, but rather as an active power. So long as man is sensuous, he is nothing but world. That he may be not merely world, he must impart form to matter. Herein lies a reversal of the passive, enduring, sensuous principle. Yet how can such a reversal come to pass? That is the whole question. It can scarcely be assumed that a man can give to his world of ideas that extraordinary range which would be necessary in order to impose a congenial form upon the material world, and at the same time convert his affectedness, his sensuous nature, from a passive to an active condition, thus bringing it to the heights of his world of ideas. Somewhere or other, man must be related, subjected, as it were, else would he be really godlike. One is forced to conclude that Schiller would let it reach a point at which violence was done to the object. But in so doing, he would concede to the archaic inferior function an unlimited right to existence, which, as we know, Nietzsche has actually done, at least theoretically. This assumption, however, is by no means conclusive with regard to Schiller, since, so far as I am aware, he has nowhere consciously expressed himself to this effect. His formula has instead a thoroughly naive and idealistic character, a character withal quite consistent with the spirit of his time, which was not yet infected by that deep mistrust of human nature and human truth which haunted the epoch of psychological criticism inaugurated by Nietzsche. The Schiller formula could be carried out only by a power standpoint, applied without ruth or consideration, a standpoint with never a scruple about equity and reasonableness towards the object, nor any conscious examination of its own competence. Only under such conditions, which Schiller certainly never contemplated, could the inferior function also win a share in life. In this way, archaic, naive, and unconscious elements, though decked out in a glamour of mighty words and lovely gestures, ever came crowding through and assisted in the molding of our present civilization, concerning the nature of which humanity is at this point in some measure of disagreement. The archaic power instinct, which hitherto had hidden itself behind the gesture of culture, finally came to the surface in its true colors, and proved beyond question that we are still barbarians. For it should not be forgotten that, in the same measure as the conscious attitude has a real claim to a certain God-likeness, by reason of its lofty and absolute standpoint, an unconscious attitude also develops, whose God-likeness is orientated downwards toward an archaic God whose nature is sensual and brutal. The In Antiodromia of Heraclitus forebodes the time when this Deus abscondicus shall also rise to the surface and press the God of our ideals to the wall. It was as though the men at the close of the 18th century had not really seen what that was which was taking place in Paris. but persisted in a certain aesthetical, enthusiastic, or trifling attitude, that they might perchance delude themselves concerning the real meaning of that glimpse into the abysses of human nature. Quote, "But in that netherworld is terror, and man tempteth not the gods, craving only that he may never, never see what they in pity veil with night and horror." End quote. Frau Schiller's Der Tag. When Schiller lived, the time for dealing with the underworld was not yet come. Nietzsche, at heart, was much nearer to it, for to him it was certain that we were approaching an epoch of great struggle. He it was, the only true pupil of Schopenhauer, who tore through the veil of naivete, and in his Zarathustra conjured up from that lower region ideas that were destined to be the most vital content of the coming age. End of section 11.